future generations. I believe Becca is going to love this first illustration about the spreading of sin in the world. Take a look at this on Sabbath afternoon. Bacteria are plant organisms too small to see without a microscope. Even after being magnified 1,000 times, one single common round bacterium appears no larger than a pencil point after being magnified 1,000 times. But given favorable conditions for growth, sufficient warmth, moisture, and food, bacteria multiply at an extremely rapid rate. For example, some bacteria reproduce by simple fission. A mature cell simply splits into two daughter cells. When fission takes place every hour, one bacterium can produce, listen to this, one bacterium can produce more than 16 million new bacteria in 24 hours. This microscopic phenomenon in the natural world illustrates the rapid growth of evil after sin. If you had your microscope in place, or if you were able to take a look at nature, take a look at Adam and Eve, as soon as sin happened, as soon as distrust happened, you would see a sudden and immediate change to the composition of the material world. Can you believe that? Can you imagine that? Because there was no decay before sin. All of a sudden, when that relationship is broken, can you imagine looking at things in a microscopic way and observing the beginning of the anthropic process? Can you believe that? Can you imagine and how fast it all started? All of a sudden, broken concert, a broken covenant brought about disruption, unbalanced disruption. And as we have seen in last Sabbath's lesson, when did God establish a covenant with human beings? When was the first episode of God's covenant with human beings? Do you remember? The lesson starts by the first mention of the word covenant by addressing our attentions to Noah in that episode. But the fact is that theologically speaking, even though the term covenant wasn't there, all of the parts of a covenant are comprised in God's relationship with human beings in Eden. It is there. You have God approaching man after he was created and establishing terms of their agreement, terms of their relationship. Because just as there is no real love outside of freedom, Jonathan cannot make you love him. You gotta love me now. No. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. I've tried. It's got to come from her decision, from her free will to love. But just as real love can only flourish in freedom, real love can only endure within limits. There are limits. There are terms. Outside of limits, outside of terms, that's not love. That's abuse. That's abuse.
Freedom itself has to be protected by certain limits. Otherwise, it's not freedom. Being locked up in a cell is something you have to limit in order to be free. I mean, you can't just go get locked up and not be able to move around and be free at the same time. They're mutually exclusive. So you need to set limits on getting locked up in a cell and other things that are less obviously restricting your freedom. You have to have limits in order to be free. And it seems counterintuitive, and yet it's kind of obvious at the same time when you look at freedom itself it has a definition, and you have to limit the opposite to have it.
That's very true. And what were the terms of God's first covenant. And here's the thing. God's covenant is based on His character. And His character is a character of love and a never-changing, a faithful love. In God, according to James, there is no hint, not even a cloud, not even a tint of change. He is everlasting. He is the same. So His everlasting covenant, as we will see the expression coming up in Abraham's covenant, next lesson or the next one after that one, we'll see that God's covenant is an everlasting one. And what happened when He talked with Adam? He revealed the terms of the covenant that were already there. God's covenant is based on His character. It does not change in essence, in principle. The terms, the practices may change based on a promise made or a promise fulfilled. Let's take a look at the terms as God presented them to Adam and Eve. In the garden, perfect world, okay? Perfect world, perfect freedom, perfect limits, all in balance. But there were still terms. Let's take a look. Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 2, verses 15 through 17. Who can read that one for us, please? Genesis 2, verses 15 through 17.
And the Lord God took the man and put him into the garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat.
Okay. First term. We already identified the qualified persons in this contract, in this agreement. It's God talking to mankind. And He put them in the garden to tend it and keep it. God was the creator of the garden, but He wants man to do what He did. He is the one who planted the Garden of Eden. God is the one who planted. Now, creating mankind, He wants them to imitate Him. Remember this concept. But here are the terms. First clause in the contract here. Of every tree of the garden you may, what's that word there? Freely eat. Everything. Is God a restrictive God? Is God someone who wants to prevent you from the good things of life? No, He wants you to enjoy everything possible that is good for you. Everything that will bring you real joy and pleasure. Our God is a giving God. But here's the point. Every contract has a way out. What was the way out? Verse 17, Jonathan, please.
But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die.
That's the way out. For them, as I mentioned last lesson, in a rural area, in a garden, they were farmers. So for them, the symbol was the tree. If I want out of this relationship, of this agreement, if I want out, there is a way out. Because that's real freedom. So the way out would be for them to eat from that tree. There were no magic, mystical powers on the tree. No powers on the fruit. There was nothing weird, nothing different there, except for the serpent, a talking serpent, and the entire moment there. But the tree in itself was not a magical tree. It was a common tree. Beautiful, just like all the other ones. The fruits, ooh, that looks really good, just like the other ones. That was just a symbol. I want out. What are the symbols that we have today? that imply in us moving away from a relationship with the Lord. Every single choice that you make, you have the option of moving out of the covenant. Every single choice, yes.
I think one good example, because is drugs. Because we see drugs as bondage. We see that because we've seen people who go that direction. It tells us we want out of God's health protecting influence in our life. It's really genuinely a symbol of that. And if we go that way, we see that there's bondage. And you can't have freedom. You can have all the benefits of freedom that you want, but you can't have the benefits of bondage if you want to be free. You can leave being free. You can go get the benefits of bondage. There are some of those that you just can't get when you're free. But it comes at the price of bondage. Are you really willing to pay the price of bondage to get the thing you can't have when you're free? Because it's part and parcel being in bondage.
That's very true. Brenda?
So I've heard people say that you drink away your problems. Hello? At some point you're going to wake up, you're going to sober up, and those same problems are still going to be there.
The problem is still there.
That's right.
Maybe worse.
You don't drink it away. That's very true.
You put in another problem on top of what was already existing.
Very true. Very true.
There's a sense in which you drink it away, but it's like the procrastinating stuff.
That's not free.
Life goes on.
And maybe the numbing for that moment. You're numb. You don't feel it because you're not remembering. You're not in your... But it's still there. It's still there. It's just a fleeing action. You're fleeing. You're escaping. It's an escape. Momentary escape.
God doesn't want us to escape.
That's very true.
He wants us to be happy and joyful. And enjoy that. Which is the freedom.
Yeah, and here's the point about freedom. Every decision implies an expanding the limits of your freedom or decreasing them. Every decision. Every decision. You are free to make choices, but you become slave of the consequences. Oh, mercy. That's a lot, right? Well, they chose another way. We have already explored a little bit about the temptation and the fall of human beings. And now, in our Sunday lesson, the sin principle, we will see how it all developed. Sin entered, and the paradigm shifted. Things weren't very good anymore, just like God had said before. All things are very good. Everything I have created, they are very good. But all of a sudden, as we talk about the first illustration of the bacteria, multiplication, all of a sudden, everything changed. How did that progress? Very fast. Because the first generation, after sin, you have murder happening. Where did it come from? Wasn't it supposed to be a letter down kind of process? Well, then we start maybe lying a little bit, and then cheating, and then less harmful stuff. No, it went from sin, murder, boom. I went out of the contract, I went out of God's agreement, and then murder happens right away.
If you look at one generation to the next, and you just take those samples. But if you take lots of samples in between, you got blaming, you do have this slow descent. It's just so much faster than we might expect.
Yeah.
It can happen in a single person's life. Babies are born innocent. So it happened over the course of Cain's life, from innocence to murder. Any murderer has that very experience. It's a fast thing, and it can happen in one person in a short time.
Which should serve as a big warning for us, right? Red flag right there. It can be really fast.
And it goes through all the steps, but that's part of why it can happen so fast, because it just doesn't seem that much worse to go just a little bit further.
That's terrible, yeah.
And so you can just go.
You get numb.
That's true.
You
Yeah.
That's true. That's
You're
true.
blind, you don't see, you don't think,
Mm-hmm.
you don't use the God-given gifts that we have, which is our brain, to
Mm-hmm.
be sober and to stay vigilant.
That's very true. So let's take a look at the process here. Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. Who can read that one for us? 3, verse 6.
So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave to her husband with her, and he ate.
There is so much to explore here, but she fell into the deception about God's character. Distrust was at the root of her actions. Disbelief was at the root of her actions. And today, we still deal with the same thing. Distrust in God's word equals disobedience. Transgression of the law. I don't trust that his word is sufficient, is wise, and I don't trust him. I don't trust his character. I don't trust what he's doing. I'll try my own way. Very good. And then, after that, and here's selfishness and pride as the basis of all sin or sinful behavior. Started in heaven with Lucifer, same procedure, same feeling. He just did the same. He drove Eve in the same process and journey that he himself had gone through. Of dissatisfaction and distrust of God, of who he is. So, after that journey, verses 11 through 13. Genesis 3, 11 through 13. Who can read that first? Genesis 3, 11 through 13.
And he said, Who told thee that thou wast naked? Hast thou eaten of the tree whereof I commanded thee that thou shouldst not eat?
Okay, here it comes. Look at the evolution.
And the man said, The woman thou gavest to me, who gavest to thee with me, she gave me the tree, and I did eat. And the Lord God said unto the woman, What is this that thou hast done? And the woman said, The serpent beguiled me, and I did eat. Blame game.
The blame game started, and Ellen White in Steps to Christ, page 17, she states that right at this moment, selfishness became the rule, the new rule, taking the place of love. At this exact moment in a behavior, external behavior, because the feeling was still there. How was the feeling still there? Have you ever thought that Eve was really selfish in her actions? Because she knew it would affect her partner. She knew that her decision would affect her partner. It's not being just, oh yeah, I'm going to eat from the tree and then I'll talk to her. No. She should, not because of any sort of headship or authority. No, based on humanity. Hey, my decision is going to impact this person. Do I love him enough to let him know, hey, you know that tree? There is this talking serpent there, very weird, but it seems to be nice. She didn't talk to him. She thought of herself first. That's the problem. From there, all destruction went on, and then selfishness took the place of love. Now, 4:5. Chapter 4, verse 5. The descension path. The progression of sin. Genesis 4:5. Who can read that one for us, please? One at a time. Genesis 4, verse 5. I'll read them. Then you need to read the next one. But he did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. Very angry. In verse 8, chapter 4, verse 8, Now Cain talked with Abel, his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and killed him. Selfishness, pride, selfishness, blame game, anger, disrespect, anger, and death, violence. And that is what is so surprising for many people when you get to the description of Lucifer's fall. When you get to Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, and you look at his ascension willingness, I will come up, I will ascend, the climbing up, artificially up, because he wasn't called to climb up. He wasn't called to take God's throne. And here's the mysterious thing. The consequence of pride and selfishness, if you get to Ezekiel chapter 28, you will see that because of everything he was doing and the commerce of words he was doing, violence became a reality. What? Pride, selfishness, and all of a sudden violence? How do you connect those things? Yes, because at the root of every proudful action, selfish action, there is violence. This is what we're talking about here. There is violence as a consequence, an ultimate consequence of selfishness and pride. It's violence at the end. Okay, and then 4:19. Let's move on. 4:19. And then Lamech took for himself 2 wives. The name of one was Ada, and the name of the second was Zillah, the first polygamist. So you start seeing a progression of broken relationships. There was no need all of a sudden for Adam to have a second wife. But then, as his descendants, they started this tradition, this behavior, all part of the dissension path, and all related to broken relationships. All related to broken relationships. And then verse 23. Then Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, wives of Lamech, listen to my speech, for I have killed a man for wounding me, even a young man for hurting me. So that's the behavior, that's the pattern. Violence right there, selfishness, and distrusting God's plan. God had given Adam Eve, period. No one else. Chapter 6, verse 2. That the sons of God saw the daughters of man, and they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, and all whom they chose. The descendants of Seth, the descendants of Cain. There's no time for us to explore all of the definitions here. There is a lot of misconception and understanding, as if angels would have been in relationships with human beings, but Christ himself said that would be like angels in heaven. They have no interaction, sexual interaction for reproduction, so on and so forth. So that's totally out of the board here. What it's talking about, it's talking about God's faithful servants, the descendants of Seth, and God's unfaithful creatures, beings, the sons of man, called so for the first time here, and then the sons of God, mentioning the ones who would follow him. But here it comes. The mixing started also. Verse 6:2, and then verses 5 and 11. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. That's where we get to Noah. The sins of man became continual. And where? Did you see the emphasis on that descending path of sin? Did you see where the core structure was beaten, sin overflows? The core structure of family. God created family. After that was broken, the bigamist started, polygamy started, and then the mixing started, different values, different plans, different principles. And because of that, it is very interesting for you to read chapter 6 of Genesis and understand that the evil continually is a result of that mixing of principles. Just mixing up and compromising your principles. This is not the mingling that we are asked and invited and called by the Lord to proceed as Christ followers. That's not the kind of mingling here. That is a mixing, Babylonic mixing of values and principles. It's like I'm joining you and then I am going to compromise my values and my principles. Jonathan.
It's like if you have, solid black pigment, solid white pigment, and you take the black and you crush up some of it and put it all over all the white ones. Now they're all black too. All you have is black. Yeah, they're good dots. When you mix the good and the bad together, it's only all you have is evil that you can see.
That's very true. And it gets harder and harder and darker.
Even your good dots.
To the point where, can you believe that? The heart of man was evil continually. How many generations from Adam to here? It was really fast, people. We're talking about 12, 14 generations till Noah. That's really fast. Really, really fast. And now we get to Monday's lesson, Genesis 6, verse 9, which is part of our memory text. Genesis 6, verse 9. We're going to read verse 8 and 9.
I have a quick question.
Yes, please.
Could we go ahead and talk a generation? I get that confused. Is that 20 or 40 years?
No, actually in Bible terms, it's listed on chapter 5 of Genesis chapter 5. It's listed based on fathers and sons and grandsons and great-grandsons, and each one meaning, symbolizing a generation. Today, sociologically speaking, we tend to count every 20 to 40 years a new generation. Baby boomers till the Gen Z right now, we count different generations, but that has a lot of input, social input from world wars and their consequences and technology, third revolution, world technological revolution. But in biblical terms, it's more related to the father and the son and the grandson, the great-grandson. So each one would be a generation in the families, in the list of families. So the man Noah, chapter 6, verse 8, Genesis 6, verse 8, verses 8 and 9. But Noah found what? Every heart evil continually. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. This is so important to come before verse 9, which is our memory text, verse 8. It's so important because if you take verse 9 out of nowhere, you would think that Noah was like an angel that was living among sinful man and that he was sinless. No, he needed grace. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. He was a sinner, but his attitude towards God and his relationship with God was of a different one. He wanted to listen and to be transformed. He wanted to be in a relationship with God. That was the difference. He wanted to be in a relationship with God. He was intentional about being in a relationship with God. And that's how he found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Verse 9. That's what introduces us, verse 9. This is the genealogy of Noah. Verse 9, Genesis 6, 9. Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations. Noah walked with God. Here you have packed in one verse so many deep theological concepts of justification, of righteousness, of perfection. And then they are all summed up in the expression, Noah walked with God. We will see at the end of this lesson, in some minutes in Hebrews, we will see how the dynamics operated of grace and Noah's response to grace. If you read verse 9 without reading verse 8, you would think we live by a legalistic kind of rule. if you read verse 9 outside of verse 8. Very good. The covenant with Noah. Verse 6, chapter 6, verse 18, as we move forward. But I will establish my covenant with you. Why did God say my covenant? Why did God use that expression? Why didn't he just say, I will establish a covenant? What comes to your mind? I will establish a covenant with you. No, he said, I will establish my covenant with you. Why would he use this possessive pronoun? Why my covenant? Why not any covenant?
It's ownership. It's his. Like you said, possessive pronoun. It's his covenant. And with this, it shows grace, as it points out here in the lesson. By establishing my covenant with Noah, God here again displays his grace. He shows that he is willing to take the initiative in order to save human beings from the results of their sins.
Mm-hmm. How is that grace? Because in basic legal terms, the necessary condition for any contract is reciprocity. That's the necessary condition. I'll give Jacob something, he'll give me something in return. That's reciprocity. That's basic ground for a regular contract. But in God's covenant, he is saying, you know what? You are not God. And you're not able to pay the price for what you did. You're not. Despite anything that you do right, you cannot pay the price. So it is my covenant because I am the guarantor of the covenant. I will guarantee its fulfillment. I will pay the penal clause or clauses, the penalty for the broken contract. I will pay for that, which is actually the enrollment, the seed of the covenant revealed to Adam and Eve in Genesis 3:15. It is a gift. Your seed, woman, will step on the head of the serpent. Your seed. But I am the one who gives you life. I am the life giver. It will cost me. So I'm the guarantor. It's his covenant because he's the only one who can fulfill it. That's why it's grace. He's the only one who can pay the price. Very good. Based on these terms of the covenant, chapter 9 now. After the covenant, after Noah had found grace in the eyes of the Lord, we get to chapter 9. What I'll do right now is I'll invert. I'll end with Wednesday's lesson, but I want to go forward with Thursday's lesson, and I want you to go with me to Hebrews chapter 11, so we can cover Thursday and Friday's lesson. Then we'll end with the sign of the rainbow. Hebrews chapter 11, and that's how the author of this book. Theologically, obviously, Paul. It's Paul's theology. Maybe the writer was someone different, a scribe or someone who was reporting on one of Paul's sermons. But Hebrews chapter 11, and I want you to read with me verse 7, which in Paul's theology, he summed up the terms of Noah's covenant, which applies to our relationship with the Lord as well today. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17. Pay close attention to the terms. By faith, it's Hebrews chapter 11, verse 7. By faith, Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear, and prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. Did you see how Paul's theology here in Hebrews go full circle in this verse? From faith to faith, by faith to faith. What is in between? What are the terms of the covenant? Pay attention to this. By faith, Noah. What came before faith?
Believe.
How Noah was able to demonstrate belief, faith. He was divinely warned. So, revelation. Faith comes by hearing. And hearing?
By the word of God.
Okay. So, revelation, these are the terms of the covenant. God takes the initiative. He comes after us. Where are you, man? Where are you, Adam, my son? Where are you, Camilla? Where are you, Amilcar? Where are you? He takes the initiative and he reveals himself to us. Every time. Every time. We serve a loving God, a faithful, trusting God. You can trust every time he will come after you. Every time. So he comes after him. He comes after Noah. And based on revelation, what was Noah's response? He believed. And that is the order that God establishes in our contact with revelation. Believe and see. We believe first, and we see it materialized as a consequence. That's the definition, actually, that starts on chapter 11 of Hebrews. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. So we believe in God's revelation first, and then it materializes. Very good. So by grace, God reveals himself, takes responsibility, and as a response to revelation, Noah believed. How does that believing materializes in seeing? Noah, a rain is coming. A flood is coming. And I will give you the instructions, the directions, and I will help you build an ark. I'll give you the strength. I'll give you the wisdom. I'll give you what you need. Build an ark. Did Noah trust God's revelation? So because of his trust in God's revelation, he obeyed. Obedience is the fruit of trust. Obedience is the fruit of trust. It's as simple as that. That's why we cannot abide by a concept of, watery down faith or salvation. That's impossible because a flood is coming. And I have to respond to God's warning. My response to God's warning is not a merit in myself. It's not a merit in myself. It's me responding to his warnings. It's his merit all over. Very good. Moving forward. So revelation, faith, brings about obedience. Moved with godly fear, with awe, with honor. He said, yeah, what God is saying is true. So he obeyed. Obedience is the outcome of trust. That's the outcome. And he prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir to the righteousness which is according to faith. What kind of righteousness did he have? What was his merit, if there was any? He believed. He believed. And he acted according to his belief. obedience. So he is called righteous because he prepared the ark and saved his household. Well, there's a lot to explore here, but it's around 10:37 already. But in a nutshell, these are the terms of the covenant, valid for us still today. If we are receiving warnings from God, from his revelation, our reaction to his warnings are going to either be trusting obedience or distrusting condemnation. That's it. That's where obedience has a place, as a response to God's revelation. That's obedience. Through and through, it comes by faith, by trusting in God's revelation. And then we come to our last part, back to Genesis chapter 9 now. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 9. And we're going to read verses 12 and 13. After the flood had happened, God blessed Noah and his sons, chapter 9, and then verse 11. Thus I establish my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant which I make between me and you, and every living creature that is with you, for perpetual generations. For all generations, which is all future generations, the title of our lesson. The sign is for all generations, for everyone. I set my rainbow in the cloud, and it shall be for the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Between me and you. You know that there are some physical realities that are undeniable around the world. For example, our 7-day week cycle. We have tried as humanity, especially the Western world after the French Revolution, for example, noticing the pattern of Christian establishment of reference time, space reference with the cycles, and then we try to move it into a cycle of 12 days and 10 days, later on 12 days. But we always came back to 7 days, which if you go by the natural phenomena, for example, the moon and its phases, you will see those cycles happening, every phase varying around 6, 7, 8 days. And then every week and month established by every 28 to 30 days. So the week, the creation, original week cycle, it's still here as a natural evidence. There is this other amazing symbol, which is this colorful one that always comes just like the week cycle. This is another natural phenomena that reminds us of who God is, along with the week cycle. Happens even more often around the world. The rainbow. The rainbow, which should actually be God's bow. Because if you're reminded in Revelation in his throne, there is a rainbow over his throne. Over God's throne, which is a symbol of what? What does that symbolize? What does the rainbow, according to Genesis chapter 9, symbolizes? It symbolizes God's perpetual, all generations included, covenant, his promise to save every single person that wills and trusts him enough. The Lord said he would use the rainbow as a sign of his covenant. How interesting that he would use the word covenant here. For in this case, the covenant differs from how it is used elsewhere. In contrast to the covenant with Abraham or the Sinai, the Mosaic covenant, there is no specific obligation expressed on the part of those who would benefit from the covenant, even from Noah. What are the terms and conditions of the rainbow? These are the rainbow is a representation of the motive, the heart of every covenant, which is grace. What do you do? What is your contribution for the rainbow? And that prism of colors to happen. What is your contribution for that? The rainbow is the ultimate natural representation of God's grace. Have you ever thought of that? The rainbow is the ultimate natural representation of God's grace. Natural, I mean in the environment, in nature. And that's amazing. All future generations included. God's words here are to all people, to every living creature of all flesh. God's words are universal, all-encompassing, regardless of whether anyone chooses to obey the Lord or not. His grace will still be there. In this sense, the concept of covenant here is not used as it is elsewhere in the Bible when talking about the relationship between God and humans, because God is the guarantor. He is the provider. And how is that made manifest objectively in the person of Jesus Christ? How? Let's write this very fast. Someone had to pay the price for the broken covenant. And God said that the seed of the woman would. And then he said that begotten son would be the inheritance. And then we see in Jesus, God himself becoming man and paying the price. So God is on one side of the contract, okay, of the covenant. And he is the guarantor. It's my covenant. I am doing it with you. And then, as he looks at Adam, he sees that he has no condition to uplift the covenant. His responsibilities of the covenant. What he does. I'll do the other part as well. That's grace. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. A milker finds grace in the eyes of the Lord. The rainbow reminds us of Jesus, who took our place, not only in death, but in resurrection. And before that, in life, because he lived the perfect life that I cannot. He upheld the human part of the covenant. He upheld it. He did the part that I can't in my place. That's why the rainbow is his covenant. It's the symbol, the ultimate symbol of his covenant. That's a God that you can trust, my brother and my sister. That's a God that you can love. A God that's not demanding from the one side, hey, you were unfair with me. Yes, we were. You did wrong. Now you're going to harvest the consequences of that. Yes, you did. But guess what? I'm going to take your place. And I'm going to do your part as well. Yeah, well, you just got to love that God and trust Him. Trust that God will take good care of you.